Hello.
Hi.
How's it going?
It's going pretty great. I'm excited for today's episode. We're doing something a little different today. We're not discussing a person. We're discussing a concept. The reason I wanted to do it is because a lot of people have heard of The Final Girl. And I think they actually completely miss the point of the academic that coined the term final girl. And they really reduced the final girl to her traits as a stock character and don't even step foot near the actual analysis, which I think is like way more interesting and kind of out there and wild. And so, yeah, I thought for Halloween it would be fitting to talk about just who is the final girl and what does she tell us about who we are as a society, especially what does it tell us about how we feel about gender and sexuality.
Awesome. So welcome to the Halloween episode of ILL REPUTE, a podcast about notorious women and gender nonconforming people. We tell their stories because they are great sluts, pioneers. They have fascinating stories that simply aren't told, or their stories are sidelined in the stories of men. And we tell their stories because we support women's rights, and more importantly, we support women's wrongs. I'm Ella Darling. I'm like getting the thing started. This is so uncomfortable. I'm not used to sitting in this seat.
Just come with it. Who the fuck are you?
I'm Ella Darling. I'm fucking Ella Darling.
And I'm Sovereign Syre. You're welcome.
God damn it. I am an ex-librarian and a porn star for officially 14 whole years now, and a virtual reality pioneer and a programmer and a not so amateur roboticist, because I did that shit professionally, and I'm
Yeah, you did. Yeah, you did.
Who the hell are you, Sovereign? Tell us about you.
My name is Sovereign Syre, and I'm a stand-up comedian and a screenwriter and a regular writer and a podcaster and a painter and a former sex worker in the public-facing commercial sex fields. So I bring a lot of gravity. I think what we bring to the table is a different perspective on historical happenings and on current cultural happenings. I think that having spent time in sex work, you really get to see people really stripped bare of any kind of propriety. You get a lot of people telling you about their deepest, darkest fears, fantasies. A lot of people misapprehend like what kinds of things we get in email. Like, yes, do we get dick pics? Sure. We also get long rambling essays about the dissolution of someone's marriage and the death of children and just every possible human life event that could possibly happen.
I am not a clinician. I'm not a therapist. I'm just a hoe. And when men send me money, I say thank you. But we both come from film too.
Yeah. So,
which is, I mean, I know it's porn, but.
So a lot of what we're going to talk about today, the only source I'm using is Men, Women, and Chainsaws by Carol J. Clover. And that's because I didn't include anybody countering or critiquing her. And I didn't use supplemental resources because, like I said before, I feel like her initial theory just never actually gets discussed, and everything takes a backseat to like a listicle of traits, and so I didn't want to sully the waters. I was like, I would like to just bring this information to the people and be like, actually, her theory was like really transgressive and wild. She wrote the book in 1992 and was talking about trans issues and pornography, and she wasn't saying they're bad. It was one of the few scholarly things I've seen that has accounted for pornography and just addressed it like the morally neutral medium that it is. And I know some people think it's not morally neutral, but the cultural content that Elle and I have created is one of the few types of cultural content that literally everyone uses. I think second only probably to, say, music or TV. I mean, it's just everyone consumes the product. So I would say that absolutely it's a morally neutral medium, like
if you feel like porn is really a moral concern for you, I'm impressed and honored that you stick with this podcast in spite of those misgivings.
Yes. I mean, yeah, I'm assuming that our listeners, but that's me assuming that our listeners are coming from our social media. And every once in a while, I get this reminder. Someone will email me and I'll get a reminder that some people find our podcast organically and they're listening because they clicked on a summary. Usually they're good emails coming from someone saying something like, I didn't have views on sex work, or I didn't know how I felt about sex work. And then I was listening to the podcast and there are certain issues that it's really helped clarify for me and make me see in a different way. So usually they're positive. I think they've always been positive. But it's those occasional reminders that, not everyone is someone that's like followed my career for 10 years and they're just a super fan and they're just listening to my latest project. We have listeners that have no idea what we even look like. Isn't that crazy?
Wow. That's actually really invigorating to think about.
Yeah.
I like the idea that we just kind of slide into someone's like field of interest because we're talking about really cool shit in a really cool way. And then we like sneak attack, we're porn stars.
Yeah. Like, ha ha, sucker.
Psych, you just learned from a hoe.
Yeah. Yeah. Like, a little gotcha.
Real quick, we like to begin our podcast by honoring the native peoples of the lands on which we're recording. I'm recording in Austin, Texas, on the historical lands of the Tonkawa, the Lipan Apache, and the Comanche tribes, who are still active societies and cultures today and deserve rights and a lot more consideration than our country offers them now or ever, frankly.
Yeah.
Huh?
I am broadcasting from my apartment in East LA, and that is the traditional land of the Chumash and Tongva people. Again, flourishing culture and extant peoples, original stewards and caretakers of the land, and continuing to do so. And yes, grateful to be here. Welcome to Ill Repute, the podcast that is figuring out what the fuck it is, but it is definitely two really cool girls talking about other cool people.
Definitely a podcast.
And yes, it is a podcast.
Guaranteed.
And it has two hosts. Host. Oh, yeah. So my first question is, Ella, do you like scary movies?
When I was younger, I loved horror films, and I still love horror film iconography. I love the classics. I love the ones that I grew up with. As I got older, they got gorier, and the way that horror was presented changed over the years, which we will discuss.
Mm-hmm.
But as I got into my teens and my 20s, it just felt much more cruel, and less like insightful or thoughtful or campy. So I'm sure if you're a horror film aficionado, I'm sorry to disappoint you because you probably thought I was too. I cut down the number of films that I watch in general, probably 90% after I left my ex-husband, because I have really bad ADHD and I don't have anyone to make me watch movies anymore. So that's where I'm at with movies and horror movies. I did watch some recently, though, to get ready.
Yeah? Which ones did you watch?
So I ended up watching the first Nightmare on Elm Street last night.
Okay.
And this morning, as per your suggestion, I watched Chasers?
Cruising?
No, Cruising.
Cruising. Yeah.
Cruising.
A classic.
It was great.
Yeah.
It was two great films. Growing up, Nightmare on Elm Street was my shit. I had a not real crush on Freddy Krueger, but just a girlish fascination. The very DIY impressive arts and crafts project on his hand.
The original.
He's a poet.
Yeah.
He accessorizes with a fancy hat.
Yes.
I wasn't old enough to realize that men who lean into hats are probably red flags.
He had the original do nothing bitch manicure, right? It was like the original DNB.
But he has one hand free so that he can still
Yeah, I think I really enjoyed the Nightmare. At first, I was really scared of them, and then I think those were the first horror movies that got me in. When I was old enough to not be scared by just like the gore stuff, and I think that. Yeah, like as movies have changed over time, I think that I sort of pieced out on horror probably like as I left my teenage years. It just wasn't something I was like super interested in. And then I think with the emergence, especially in the 2000s, of like the Saw franchise where and like the Human Centipede where it became literally just about like the most depraved things possible. And
it was like horror aristocrats.
Yeah. It just kind of got like, what are we doing here? Like, it's not campy and fun. It's not making a statement. It's not satire. It's literally torture porn. For the sake
That's around the time that it lost my attention too. It's those films that, now that you mention it, that stand out, that it was just like, I guess it's just not for me anymore.
Yeah, I think when I was a teenager, seeing people sliced open and seeing stuff like that was really fascinating because it's so taboo and we're fascinated by the human body. I think that was the same time I was like looking up faces of death and trying to find crime scene photos. And I think that there's just a part of our development, right, where there is this curiosity around death as we start to understand that it's going to happen to us one day. I think that and just like when anything's really taboo, death is very taboo, how we're allowed to talk about it. Autopsies, like we don't release autopsy photos, things like that, right? Like there's a place where society has said, like, we will not, like, we don't go here. We tread very lightly here. And I think for me as a teenager, looking up crime scene photos, it was like, I want to see the taboo thing. Like, what is it I'm not supposed to even look at?
Yeah.
And once I'd gotten my fill, I was kind of ready to move on. You know what I mean? Like you get to a certain part where, okay, like that's what a crime scene looks like. That's what it looks like when someone's been murdered. Okay, that's what it looks like when someone's killed themselves. Okay, I know what that is now. And like, okay, I'm good. And I think that kind of like pornography, I feel like that journey is like kind of a private, personal one, right? Like kind of just like with pornography, it's like you're looking up crime scene photos like by yourself, like on a computer in your bedroom, like you're not talking about it with your friends. The same thing with porn, right? It's like you're consuming it very privately. It's one of I think sex and death are like the two journeys that we go on solo. They're very internal and very solo when we start, and like no one else can do it for us. It's like that's like a negotiation that we have to come to terms with because there's such a taboo around sort of discussing them publicly or showing them publicly.
That's really interesting because it was in my teenage years, actually probably around 12, when I started the goth phase that I'm still wicked in. And that's when I got really into, the macabre and death and all of that. And I was really into horror movies. That's when I was a senior in high school, or maybe right after I graduated high school. Me and my friends started doing like zombie makeup, and we'd go to zombie movies dressed like cool zombies. And it was really exciting. And then in undergrad, my forensic psychology professor pulled me aside. I was her TA. She pulled me aside and she had found my zombie photos on my MySpace. And she was like, look, if you want to work in courtrooms, you can't really put this out there in public. And that's when I started kind of rethinking how I engage with that stuff in like through the lens of the career that I thought that I wanted.
Right.
Now, after that, 2 or 3 days later, over the course of 2 or 3 days, I quit the circus sideshow that I was in. I quit modeling. I deleted my Model Mayhem. I deleted my MySpace, and I was real sad until I was like, fuck this. Why am I giving up the stuff that I love for a job I don't have? And then I decided to become a librarian. But all of that, because my undergraduate was in forensic psychology, like my minor was in criminal justice, seeing real crime and learning about it and engaging with it in that way made cinematic depictions that strive to be too realistic just feel unnecessary in terms of the sort of media that I have those boxes checked just from my schoolwork. So I need something a little bit campier at this point.
Yeah.
If I'm going to watch horror, which is why I like zombies,
Yeah. I think for me, I tend to prefer psychological horror. I like movies that get into that kind of suspense. I just find that much more satisfying. I don't find gore very interesting. And surprisingly, like, I'm not really turned off by stuff. Like, a lot of movies when I was reading this book and I think she cites like over 150 different films. So like but she was in the section on rape revenge and talking about people's reaction to, especially during the exploitation period, there were a lot of those produced. Mm-hmm. And all of the editing that the censors wanted to do was like trimming seconds and minutes off of the rape scenes. Because they felt they were too real and too disturbing. And I was like cackling. I was like, that's the point, asshole. Like, it's supposed to be, It's supposed to be upsetting. But then I was like, I could watch tons of rape scenes in movies because given how often it happens, we actually don't see it depicted in film very much at all.
That's true.
And
That's true.
I would say I would much rather that depictions of rape be as realistic and uncomfortable as possible. Like, that's the kind of discomfort you want people to feel. You want people to be viscerally upset when they watch a rape scene, not titillated. And
you want to confront them with the realities and the truth, not some softened version of it for their consumption.
Yes. So I was a little surprised there when I was just like, I don't know, like, considering how much it happens, it's like, it's actually not really in very many movies at all.
That's true. That's very true.
All right. So before we get into the final girl, that was just us getting warmed up. Before we get into the final girl, I wanted to talk very briefly, because I'm trying to keep it tight. That's what she said. But I wanted to do just like a quick kind of run through like the history of horror up until we meet the final girl, just so that there's a little bit of background and we're paying a little bit of lip service to the genre, because I'm sure there's going to be film nerds listening that are like, well, like, but you didn't mention. Yes, we know, Brandy. We know. we know. We left it out for time. We left it out. We can't. Whenever people are like, but you didn't listen. This is a podcast run by two hoes. This is not Wikipedia. This is not a replacement for a deep dive graduate course in film. Get the fuck out of here. Okay, for the rest of you, here's a fun little trip down memory lane and the history of horror films as we know them coming into being. So, some of the earliest horror films include Georges Méliès' Le Manoir du Diable and Frankenstein, 1896 and 1910, respectively.
We have props. So
okay.
If you're watching this on YouTube.
Aww,
Frankenstein.
so cute.
I just walked around my apartment and grabbed anything that seemed like it was relevant to the script. So. There may be other things popping in.
Okay.
We may have to censor some of them.
Oh, awesome. So these were short, silent films, and they featured supernatural and monstrous elements. German expressionist cinema in the 1920s, with classics like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and Nosferatu, had a significant influence on the genre. And I mean, Nosferatu, everybody knows that kind of iconic vampire, that film kind of really blew up the genre of horror because people loved it. And
it's one of the remaining vampire films where the vampire is not inherently fuckable.
To you, I mean...
Oh, you know what? Hey, there's no accounting for taste, I guess.
Listen.
The Cabinet of Dr. Kilgore, I put a little note here. I got to see this. I got to see the LA Philharmonic Orchestra play this at the Disney Concert Hall in downtown LA. And I had seen it before and I didn't think shit about it because I have ADHD and I didn't really care.
Yeah.
But seeing it in that setting kicked so much ass. So they do it in October. You should check it out if you get a chance.
Oh yeah, I'll see if it's I'll see if they're doing it this year. Yeah. I go to the theater. I'm a continental woman.
Cultural as fuck.
Yeah, I'm super, you know.
If you're listening to this via audio only, I was just holding up a little plush Frankenstein that is very adorable. So
it's very, very
check out the YouTube though, because it's very cute.
Yeah, it's very cute.
The 1930s marked the rise of iconic universal monsters such as Dracula, Frankenstein's monster, the Mummy, the Wolfman, and the Invisible Man. These films, including Dracula, Frankenstein, and The Bride of Frankenstein, laid the foundation for the horror genre's popularity. The 1940s and 1950s saw the continuation of classic horror with films like The Creature from the Black Lagoon. This is a cutting board that I own.
Super cool.
Glass. It has The Creature from the Black Lagoon on it. And this is not an actual plug, but the company I work for has like a side project called Monster Cocks, and this one is based on The Creature from the Black Lagoon. It's called The Creature Cock.
The Creature Cock.
And just for good measure, I think this one is called Frankencock. It's stitched together.
Oh, wow.
Very interesting silicone pieces of art.
It reminds
shaped like sex toys.
That one reminded me of someone I used to fuck.
That's heartbreaking for both of you.
I mean, not the stitching, just the girth and the length, just the general dimensions. It just, I'm like,
Aww. In addition to The Creature from the Black Lagoon, also Invasion of the Body Snatchers in 1954 and 1956, respectively, if you're keeping up, which I'm not. This era also witnessed the emergence of the science fiction horror hybrid driven by Cold War fears and atomic age anxieties, which was some of my favorites, actually.
Yeah. It was really fun to kind of do this deep dive into it in this sort of analysis around like why different genres are popular at different times. For me, what's interesting is the transition of like what the darkness is, you know, and how that kind of it's not like a straight ascending line. It's sort of things come in and out of being popular. The 1950s were marked by significant societal changes and anxieties, including the aftermath of World War II, the beginning of the Cold War, nuclear proliferation, and the fear of nuclear annihilation. These fears found expression in the creation of larger-than-life monsters and creatures that symbolized the collective anxieties of the era. The post-war saw tremendous advancements in science and technology. These developments sparked both excitement and fear. The concept of scientific experiments gone awry or radiation-induced mutations resulted in the creation of many iconic monsters, such as Godzilla and the giant ants in them. And I thought that was really interesting because I had an old grandfather, and he was quite old when I was very young, but he had been in World War II. And I remember when I went as like a graduation gift, and it was one of the few times we connected where I was a grown up enough to like have heavy conversations. And he was in the French Resistance. He was in World War II. He did a bunch of stuff. He was in Okinawa. He was all over the place. And I had asked him what it was like at the time. And he said, there's no way I can describe the before and after the bomb. Like the world just changed overnight when that happened. And the sense that we all just kind of thought we were going to die, that there was no way this was not going to end in a nuclear war. And so he said, we were the first generation that could conceptualize its collapse. And
Wow.
that really, he's like, people were wild. He was very upfront with me. He was French. So they already have weird rules around sex, you know, like you can have a gangbang, you know, in the middle of the table at like a family lunch and you know,
The French.
c'est la vie. C'est si bon. Anyway, but he's like, people were having orgies. Everyone was trying to fuck all the time. He was like, to be stationed anywhere. I mean, people think of the 50s as this really restrained and everything in the past is whatever. He's like, the 40s were crazy. He's like, the 40s were like the 70s in terms of like, people were just doing really wild shit because everyone thought that they were going to die and had no trust in government institutions to protect anyone from that fate, you know? So it was really interesting to have a conversation with someone that lived through the before and after of that moment. And that it was cool that he happened to be a cultural studies professor. So I got to happen to have that conversation with someone who not only went through it, but had all of the language to frame it and contextualize it for Baby Sav.
Oh.
Yeah.
The atomic bomb and the testing of nuclear weapons were central concerns during this period. The idea of radiation turning ordinary creatures into terrifying monsters was a recurring theme. The space race and the fear of the unknown beyond Earth's atmosphere contributed to the popularity of extraterrestrial and space-themed monsters. Films like The Day the Earth Stood Still and Invasion of the Body Snatchers explored themes of alien invasion and the fear of the other. What I love about horror and the history of horror is that just like any other media or medium in media, it just reflects the culture at the time, and it reflects sort of societal, you know, thoughts and opinion at the time. This is something that porn does that I think a lot of people blame porn for making something popular when it becomes popular because a lot of people are consuming it.
Yeah.
And so it's just like, you're the one driving, like, this is a reflection of you. Horror films are a reflection of you. It's a reflection of society at that time. And I think it's really easy to lose that context when you're watching old films. It's easy to forget the story, like the framework of the story that it was building on, that was in the public zeitgeist at the time.
Yeah. And like I said, this author kind of goes into to compare pornography and the horror genre and sort of explaining why the low budget of the nature of them being low budget and easily replicatable because they're very formulaic is precisely what makes them a really rich ground for cultural analysis. The narratives aren't being stifled by corporate interests. And so the way that they come into being is more likely to reflect the actual attitudes of the people writing it, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Anyway, we'll get to that. So the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union generated a climate of paranoia and fear. This fear of hidden enemies and the potential for espionage and infiltration influenced the creation of monsters that resembled ordinary people but were secretly dangerous, as seen in films like Invasion of the Body Snatchers. In the 1960s and 70s, which were marked by more significant cultural shifts and social upheaval, issues such as civil rights, the Vietnam War, and the counterculture movement created a sense of societal unrest and disillusionment. Psychological horror films often reflected and tapped into this atmosphere of unease and uncertainty.
Invasion of the Body Snatchers is just really killing it in every aspect of the genre.
Yeah. I don't like zombie movies, and I have a hard time with slashers because I realize that I have a hard time investing in the narrative if there's no reason why the killing is happening. Like if the killer is even if it's a shoestring size motivation, but if the killer isn't realistic, it just takes me out of it. It's like I want to get some sense of who they are as a person, or like what is driving them to do the things that they're doing. And if that's not present, and so that was why I generally didn't like zombie movies, because the danger doesn't, it seems kind of hopeless. It's like the danger is ever present and unrelenting, but also without any kind of motivation. And so for me as a viewer, it's just kind of like, I can't get into it for some reason. Like I can't get a hook in there emotionally, you know?
I love zombie films because I like observing the way the concept of zombification is treated from film to film. Questions like, do they use the word zombie? Do they use some slang, like Z, or just hearing the emerging, like the new ideas of slang words to call zombies,
right?
Over time. And then also, initially, hell was full. So now, the evil is coming back and people are coming back to life and eating people and killing people. And so one concept is, hell's just too full. So I guess this is like what happens when you don't compost your evil souls.
Right.
And then, in some case, and then it's, it's like a virus and you die and it's almost like well, in some cases, it literally is a parasite, in which case, is that really a zombie? Because is a parasite the same thing? Is it a virus? Is it, do you have to simply be bitten if you get a drop of zombie blood in your eyeball, like in 28 days later? Is that going to be enough to infect you? Do they and at what point, how fast does infection happen?
Right.
And then the other part I like to observe is, how are the zombies themselves treated? Because not treated, but how are they approaching the zombies? Are they slow moving because their bodies are slowly decaying and, they just fall apart because that's what they're doing? In that case, are there skeletons walking around? How are we defining this?
Right.
And then in some cases, like 28 days later, I think they're fast as hell. They were all track stars, apparently. And so it's just this one genre has so many different nuances, and some of them, as they evolve, sort of takes a greater look at society. Like when it starts to become something that's, an airborne thing, it's reflective of our fear of pathogens, our fear of infection, our fear of globalization.
Yes. I was going to say a certain thing I've noticed is that in movies about contagion or whatnot, so say a zombie movie, or say like The Exorcist, right? Those could both be arguably there's a penetration that happens, right? And then it starts to dissolve away the person, the host.
Mm-hmm.
Both types of movies are never really about the zombies or the possessed the possessed person. They're about how people survive through it and that interdependence. So it's there, and in The Exorcist, the movie's really more about the relationship between Reagan's parents, her exorciser, and the doctor. You know what I mean? It's about their relationship with the world and with with the occult versus science, and about them wrestling with accepting that this kind of Catholic magic is real and not scientific. And with zombie movies, it's not about the zombies. It's about the relationships generally that form between The Last of Us and what they tell us about the human condition. So I think that's really interesting that in those movies, and I think this is true of a lot of horror, is a lot of times they're not even about the horror. They're about how people navigate those fears and generally have to create some kind of community with each other despite having maybe disparate interests or values. And they have to still find a way to come together to overcome or overwhelm the killer or the disease etc. So it's also, if you think about it, these movies are like very gay.
That's why I like them, because everybody collaborates together and it's community at what cost, I don't know, but everyone it's like teamwork makes the dream work.
Yeah.
And as soon as you stray from that, as soon as you deviate from investing in the human endeavor as it remains, you're probably going to die.
Yeah. So, I mean, I just think it's cute that even in horror films, you're actually just very gay and very earnest and sincere and still the conscience of this show.
Filmmakers of this era, such as Alfred Hitchcock, Roman Polanski, and Stanley Kubrick, embraced innovative storytelling techniques and psychological depth. Also, huge fucking pieces of shit. Was Kubrick a piece of shit?
So in The Shining, Shelley Duvall plays the wife of Jack Nicholson, who's a writer that takes on a job to be the caretaker for a lodge that is kind of out in the middle of nowhere, like over the winter when it's closed. And it's a classic. So during their stay, increasingly supernatural and scary things start happening, and it builds on this horror, and he starts to become or seem possessed by something. And so in the film, Shelley Duvall, the wife, is kind of slowly going mad, right? Like she's everyone is, but it's like she's sort of watching her husband kind of devolve in front of her. She's seeing weird things. She's taking care of this baby. He decided that he would get a better performance out of Shelley Duvall if everyone on set and everyone participating basically kind of not abused her, but kind of shut her out.
Yeah.
To kind of create the same circumstance that the character is in. So just kind of making her feel very isolated. And that was like intentional, basically. So for the entirety of the filming, she felt like she was constantly on the outside and like everyone else was on the inside. And his thing was like, well, I mean, but that's what the story is, right? And like that's kind of, so like we said about our tours.
So Kubrick is a piece of shit. Polanski's a rapist. Hitchcock was also an auteur who thought torturing his actresses was his right as an artist. So all heads. However, their films emphasize suspense, tension, and the intricacies of the human psyche, contributing to the popularity of psychological horror. Hitchcock's Psycho is also a landmark in the horror genre. It's got a lot of psychological horror, lots of suspense. And then Rosemary's Baby and The Exorcist were also very influential at the time.
So psychological horror subverted traditional horror conventions by placing the terror and horror within the human mind rather than solely on external threats or supernatural elements. This subversion appealed to audiences seeking more thought-provoking and intellectually challenging horror. The period saw the rise of independent filmmaking and the emergence of filmmakers like Roman Polanski and David Cronenberg, who were both willing to take risks with unconventional narratives and explore psychological horror in depth. So
Cronenberg had a film called Rabid in 1977, starring Marilyn Chambers, who is a porn star. She's in the AVN Hall of Fame. She's a golden era porn star.
She was Behind the Green Door, right?
Yes. Yeah. And I love this about him and about this film, because when I was thinking about this episode, a lot of the mainstream films that I've done have been horror films or horror adjacent. And I think that horror directors just feel, like you said, they don't have big corporate entities sort of leering over them. And therefore, they're able to hire adult film performers, more readily for roles. Also, it's probably not union more often than not. So,
well, also like we're willing to do nudity, and because we fuck on film. And I had an ex-boyfriend that was an acting coach and stuff like that, and he used to always say that he found working with sex workers in general to be much easier because people working in sex work just have much more immediate access to like their visceral feelings because they do it on camera so much. So they can pull up intense emotions really quickly and they're not shy.
Absolutely.
So like they're also great to cast in films for that reason. Like they don't have the same boundaries and they're not as concerned with how they're going to appear. And it's also just easier for them to call up a blood-curdling scream or to pretend to be really afraid or to pretend to be in the throes of ecstasy. It's very easy for us to just pull that out of the like out of your back pocket.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's just nice to be given the opportunity. I was in Evil Bong 420, maybe part 2 or 3. I don't remember. I never watched it. I had my tits out. There was an anthropomorphic bong. I turned it off.
I'm trying to think. The only mainstream thing I was in was a show called Westworld.
Oh, you were in Westworld.
I was.
The gold scene with like people that were painted gold. Okay, I think Stokes was in that. I'll look for you next time I watch it. That's so cool.
Yeah, I had a fan be like, "I recognized your ass right away."
Aww,
and I was like, so flattered.
That is so sweet. I cosplay as Dolores, so like, I'm fangirling you just a little bit right now. The last film that I remember doing was a horror film. It was a horror parody film, Dude Bro Party Massacre 3. Where I'm a sorority sister and we're streaking, and then the murderer Motherface like throws an electrical wire into this puddle, so when we're streaking through the puddle we all get electrocuted, and then this guy comes along in rain boots and he sees a bunch of naked girls and he's like and then he reaches down to touch a boob, and while his boots were protecting him from the electrified water, he touches my boob and then dies. So my tits have a KD ratio.
Fuck yeah.
Yeah.
Fuck yeah. I dig it.
Freud's psychoanalytical theories, particularly those about the unconscious mind and repressed desires, had a profound influence on the psychological horror genre. Filmmakers drew on these ideas to create narratives that probed the depths of the human psyche. Some of the iconic psychological horror films during this period were Psycho, Rosemary's Baby, and The Shining, which we've mentioned, which obviously have lasting impact on our culture.
Yeah. And I think that's the first time that horror kind of graduated into a genre that seemed culturally significant. Mm-hmm. Because again, kind of like Nosferatu, it was like, oh, people like really like this stuff. Mm-hmm. Like even smart people, even culturally literate people really like this stuff. And so I think that also allowed for there to be more growth in the industry. So they weren't being given huge budgets, but this is around the, Wes Craven, his first film, I think one of his first films was Last House on the Left, which is still one of the most controversial films ever made and distributed, and is still illegal and banned in the UK as like one of the video nasties.
Wow.
But so, they were starting to give them some money. Like people were starting to recognize that no matter, like if you did horror, like people were going to watch it, and it was like a broad swath of people were going to watch it. So it was going to make money, because everything's about money.
Yeah, of course.
But I think having such heavy hitters delve into this territory really kind of opened it up and allowed for it to become sort of as prolific as it is now, mm-hmm. and as varied, mm-hmm. was because that respectability of these like auteur directors like deigning to do horror fare, which had been considered always very lowbrow.
Right.
And they really elevated it and got it to a place where people did start to take it a little more seriously. Okay. And put their money behind that investment.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So the 80s gave rise to the slasher subgenre, characterized by masked killers and high body counts, which, you know what? I am not going to judge anybody by their body count. That's bullshit. Kill and be killed. Slay it. That was stupid.
Slay, queen, slay.
So iconic films would be Halloween, Friday the 13th, and A Nightmare on Elm Street, featuring my crush, Freddy Krueger. The feminist movement and changing gender roles were significant influences during this time. Slasher films often portrayed female protagonists who were resourceful and resilient, challenging traditional gender roles and stereotypes for fucking once. These films sometimes included a subtext of female empowerment, which, I guess so. As long as you're a virgin and you don't do drugs.
Well, I mean, I think that, and this is where we're getting at like the real thesis of men, women, and chainsaws. Right. Or it might be women, men, and chainsaws, because she's a feminist scholar, so she probably put women first. As she should. Women and women first. Men and children, irrelevant. Women and women first.
Co-signed.
It took me forever to get that Portlandia joke. I was like, I don't get the women and women first. Like, what's that? And then it was like, it finally dawned on me like, oh, because it's like women and children first normally. So by saying women and women first, they're like, fuck them kids. and I'm behind that. I stand 100%. So the setting of many slasher films is suburban or rural locations where characters are isolated and cut off from help, which creates a sense of vulnerability and fear. This reflected the growing urbanization and societal concerns about safety in secluded areas. Slasher films tapped into societal anxieties and fears, including concerns about crime and violence. The killers in these films often represented the lurking dangers of the world, feeding into concerns about personal safety. So think about it this way. You had kind of white flight, right? Like where people were leaving urban areas, white people especially, and moving into suburbs. But that also meant they were more isolated. It wasn't like being in New York City or Chicago where you walk down the street and it's like bustling with people and you're never really alone. And also when you think about it, the 70s and 80s, if you watch any documentary about Los Angeles or New York or Chicago, crime rates were fucking skyrocketing. I mean, there really was just like a huge, like, big like uptick wave of crime at this time, and people were scared. You know, people were scared of. That's just like when you had the emergence of like real gangs. You know, like before you'd had like the Ku Klux Klan and the Hells Angels and stuff, and now you're starting to see more of like the street gang emerge. And there was a lot of sensationalism in the news at this time around things that criminals were doing. You know, and it seemed like the news was almost its own horror movie, reporting on these horrible crimes, these rapes and gang rapes and stabbings that were happening on the streets of New York, and these innocent victims. I mean, there was definitely like a narrative, that the if it bleeds, it leads narrative.
I was about to ask, when is that about the time that if it bleeds, it leads became commonplace in journalism?
I know I'm like being best friends with the Wikipedia, but in this answer, I have to say I don't know.
That is okay.
I believe that if it bleeds, it leads was probably in the 80s. And I think that probably had to do with, it has everything to do with advertising and the advertisement model of news programming, right? Is that they have sponsors. And I dated a TV journalist when I was younger, and he told me that the way it was at his job. So he wasn't a news reader. He was an actual journalist, but he was on camera talent. And he said that his manager would come in and be like, okay, so the stats say that people are like feeling really safe and comfortable right now. So we need to do a lot of stories about how much danger there is out there. And then he would come in 6 months later and be like, okay, we're seeing that people are like really scared right now. So we need to do like a lot of human interest pieces. So he said that the interaction between sensational news media and the audience was they were always interacting with each other, and it was incredibly calculated. And so because I had asked him, I was like, is that true? If it bleeds, it leads. And he was like, oh, you don't even know.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and I think it was like the 80s, because I feel like that's when I think everything was about social change, and news had an air of respectability around it. You had Walter Cronkite. You had these kind of institutions of journalism, and they had always said that the Vietnam War ended when Walter Cronkite decided it was over, because they started actually just showing the brutality going over there, and everybody freaked out. And then it was very quickly public perceptions around the war in Vietnam like shifted radically, and everyone was like, get them out of there. And I think that gave way to more tabloid style journalism in the 80s, where just everything became about clicks. There was no longer a concern for like respectability.
I like that you said clicks, because they weren't clicking anything except, I guess, the remote. But that impact has been so monumental in the way that news is provided to us, that information is provided to us, the striking that constant balance of keeping them afraid but engaged, like that. It never went away. It just got more and more technologically advanced and targeted. So you mentioned how with people moving to suburban neighborhoods, there's a lot of people still, there's a lot of families in a neighborhood, but you don't have constant people around. You don't have people around you all the time, strangers though they may be, to bear witness to a potential crime that might happen to you. Somebody being scary or attacking you. So when I was a little kid, and ever since I was a kid and lived in suburban neighborhoods, and I learned, for example, that some of my friends, when I learned that some of my friends were enduring heinous abuse from their parents at home, it just made it even creepier to walk around a neighborhood where there's lots of people, but they're all in their little ticky-tacky homes, and there's this sort of veneer of respectability because it's a good neighborhood, and there's abject horror going on behind which door? Who knows? And so it's that creeps me out, and it still creeps me out. There's like, people can see out, but like you still feel isolated and alone,
Yeah. So I think this is the other thing that is happening, right? As culturally, as people are moving to suburbs, which are notions of privacy. You no longer have the gossiping women on the stoop outside the brownstone that are kind of an element of social control. It's like they're keeping an eye on things. They know who's what, when, where. And in suburbs, the premium became privacy. So it was an active discouragement from being involved with like your neighbors or knowing what was going on around the neighborhood.
Yeah, but you still
which was different.
The busybody in the gossip. I mean, being in a neighborhood, especially in a cul-de-sac, you can just see everything going on. So that was probably, that sort of nagging busybody gossip woman was probably the one actually watching over, and like she was the neighborhood watch in some cases.
Yeah, but you didn't have that in a suburb. You didn't have the one person sitting on the porch just like calling out to everybody, like the way you would in like New York, like, "Hey, Miss Johnson," like, "Oh, that girl looks pregnant as fuck." Like you didn't have that person going like, "Hey, Carol, hey, you looking good. Ooh, she's been gaining some weight. I don't even know." Like you didn't have that person. Like there wasn't the same level of like kind of active engagement with your neighbors. Like politeness was giving them privacy. So you may have had your suspicions, but like you weren't like it had shifted, and part of that became like a fear of strangers. Mm-hmm. And it was a little before my time because I'm old, but not like that old. But the friends that I have that were, preteens in the 80s, right, talked about the belief that children were being abducted off the streets like every 5 minutes and being involved in Satanism and all of this shit. And I think that stranger danger is what emerged in the 80s, which include like, so that's what I'm saying, like in suburbs there was no longer a premium on being like involved as a community. There was actually like a fear of strangers and this idea that each house was its own little compound that had whatever was going on inside, but like no one on the outside got to be in there. Like,
that's not my experience living in the suburbs, but it's adjacent to that. So my experience living in the suburbs is that people generally want to know their neighbors because they want to have a scope of who's around them. They want to know their names. I never lived any place where they had like block parties or anything like that. It wasn't that tight knit of a community, but you certainly, mostly through the kids, because most of these homes are like family homes. So you know the family up the street because they play with your 10-year-old, and you know the people next door because they're next door. But then you also know their friends who live across the neighborhood because they come over sometimes. And so there is this sense of like knowing each other and community involvement. However, it's very waspy surface level. You simply don't ask. There are some things that it's just none of your business. And so you don't have the same protection as, you know, the woman on the brownstone who's just telling it like it fucking is. You have everybody coexisting and almost sort of perpetuating and enabling a more insidious home life because they can show up to, you know, the events, you know, the school's homecoming football game or whatever, and, you know, play the part of a nice cohesive family and then go home and beat their kids.
Yeah. I think that's what I mean.
Yeah.
Is like there wasn't like the same kind of like real connection. But like also you caught me because like I grew up in shitty Section 8 apartments in ghettos my entire life and whatnot. So my experience of suburbanness is from watching it in movies and just going like, what's that like?
Yeah.
That seems fucking not fun.
I'm drawing it all
like,
from Carlsbad, New Mexico. So, you know, look, slasher films were known for their graphic violence and gore. It was a huge departure from previous horror films because it was willing to go there. The shock value is what attracted the audiences because they wanted to feel like visceral experiences that were very intense when they were engaging with films. Slasher films often followed a formulaic structure with a group of characters being systematically killed off, which allowed for easy replication, which is also just a reflection of Dungeons and Dragons. Don't split the party. I mean, that's where you go wrong.
Yeah.
This led to a proliferation of slasher films in the 80s. The rise of home video and cable television in the 80s made it easier for people to access and watch slasher films, which did contribute to their popularity. But that brings us to the final girl, Savi.
Yes, it does. So prior to the enforcement of the production code, or what's called the Hays Code in 1934, some horror films featured more explicit and suggestive content. For example, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde explores themes of sexual repression and desire. In the post-World War II era in the 1950s, horror films often depicted traditional gender roles and conservative values. Sexual content was typically subdued, and the focus was more on external threats such as monsters and aliens. Films like Creature from the Black Lagoon used the female lead as a romantic subplot, but avoided explicit sexuality.
So you mentioned the Hays Code, and because I'm a librarian, I can't help it. We actually studied it in library school. So the Hays Code was eventually overturned in 1952 in a landmark Supreme Court decision, which led to the court reversing their stance on movie censorship entirely. They determined that film is protected under the First Amendment. And they said, it cannot be doubted that motion pictures are a significant medium for the communication of ideas. Their importance as an organ of public opinion is not lessened by the fact that they are designed to entertain as well as inform. Which I thought was pretty cool. I thought that was a very sensible place for the Supreme Court to land on a topic. The 60s and 70s saw the emergence of psychosexual horror with films like Psycho and Rosemary's Baby. These films explored sexual themes, but often in a dark and psychological context. They tapped into anxieties about sexual liberation, pregnancy, and gender roles. The 80s saw the emergence of the AIDS epidemic, which had an impact on horror films. Some, such as The Hunger, explored themes of disease and sexuality, reflecting the fears and anxieties of the time.
And go ahead.
The final girl.
The final girl. Have you watched The Hunger?
No, I haven't.
It features the most iconic lesbian scene of all time between Susan Sarandon and the French actress. Why is it escaping me like right now? Catherine Deneuve.
Yes.
Catherine Deneuve. So it also stars David Bowie, plus, who starts aging rapidly, and he goes to visit Susan Sarandon, who is a scientist that works with blood and is at like a research facility. And she decides to try to help him because he starts aging rapidly, like in front of her. So she becomes convinced that this is a real thing that's happening. Mm-hmm. And the movie ensues, and it is really good. And when you look at it in the context of the AIDS epidemic, it is like it just really kind of, that essentially like that's really what that movie was about people just everywhere kind of just getting very, very sick and then dying. And there's not even a name for this thing and no one knows what it is. And the helplessness of that and the fear of that. It's you should definitely watch it. It is chef's kiss. I mean, it's beautifully shot, perfectly acted, and it's iconic. I mean, it's very.
I haven't seen it, but I have read an interview with Susan Sarandon because I believe she's a producer on Bombshell, the Hedy Lamarr story. So I was just kind of looking into her to see like, oh, I wonder what she thinks of Pose. And after filming that scene, she said that she could, when she retires, she might shoot pornography because she thinks she thinks that porn gets a lot of stuff wrong, and she had apparently such a good time shooting that scene with Catherine Deneuve that she might join our team someday.
Look, she's hella sexual, like Susan Sarandon. Mm-hmm. You could say what you want, and be like, oh, she's too much into Bernie, or I don't care, like. That she's like Helen Mirren. It's like the sexuality within her is so potent. Mm-hmm. Like it cannot be dimmed by age. It cannot be dimmed by politics. It cannot be dimmed by anything. Mm-hmm. And if she ever hears this, Susan, I will shoot a scene with you. I actually was shot by Clayton Cubbett. And he takes Polaroids after the shoot, and he took a Polaroid of me, and then he put it down, and right next to it was a Polaroid of Susan Sarandon wearing the same crown I was. And I was like, what's this? He's like, oh, she was the last person I shot.
Oh my God.
And so I have this picture of both of our Polaroids like next to each other on a shelf.
That's amazing. Every time I've gone to New York, I've tried to set up a shoot with him, and it has simply never worked out. And I just don't go there anymore. And that breaks my heart because now he's so great. He's really great. Okay. Here emerges the final girl. So slasher films of the 1980s often combined sexuality with horror, featuring young, sexually active characters who are often targeted by killers. The final girl is a term often used in the context of horror films, particularly slasher films, to describe a recurring character archetype. The final girl is typically a young woman who is the last survivor and main protagonist in a horror film, especially in situations where a group of friends or characters is systematically killed off by a villain or monster. The concept of the final girl was popularized by film scholar Carol J. Clover in her 1992 book, Men, Women, and Chainsaws: Gender in the Modern Horror Film. Clover argued that the final girl represents a shift in the portrayal of women in horror. Unlike a lot of the earlier horror films where women were depicted as helpless victims, the final girl is typically portrayed as resourceful, intelligent, and capable of facing and defeating the threat. She's got her shit together. The final girl is the character who shows the strongest survival instincts. She often makes rational decisions, uses her wits, and is determined to outlast the threat. She's often depicted as morally upright or innocent, in contrast to other characters who might engage in risky or questionable behavior. This contrast highlights her virtue and emphasizes the idea that she deserves to survive.
Deserves, that's the word, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the final girl frequently displays independence and self-reliance. She may be separated from the group of friends or allies and must fend for herself. She typically confronts the killer or antagonist in a climactic showdown. She may be injured, but ultimately prevails, defeating or escaping from the threat. In some cases, the final girl may undergo a transformation throughout the film, becoming more assertive and empowered as she faces adversity.
In many cases, the final girl is depicted as the embodiment of traditional feminine qualities such as innocence, purity, and virtue. While these qualities can be seen as positive, they can also perpetuate the idea that women who do not conform to these norms are less deserving of survival or sympathy. It can reinforce the idea that women who engage in more masculine or assertive behavior are less likely to be the survivors. Real quick aside, before we started recording today, I called my friend Jessa Flux, who's an emerging scream queen. She's like in the Midwest and she's been in 30 independent horror films and she's just like killing it. And she's a badass, smart feminist woman. And so I just wanted to hear, I just wanted to get in the headspace, hey, you're a scream queen. Tell me all about it. And we talked a little bit, and then she sent me a voice note afterwards, just specifically addressing the fact that when she plays a bimbo character, she's almost definitely going to die because bimbos are sexy. And if you have sex, you have to, as a woman in a horror film, that's a death sentence. And she sent me something kind of insightful that was cool. I'll send it to you later. But just talking about how this is really
you're not going to read it?
Well, I mean,
you're not going to read it for us?
Audio.
You can't do that kind of, play from your phone.
Okay.
You can't do that kind of lead up and then not.
Okay. I just didn't want to play tinny. I hate in rap songs when they start with their answering machine recording.
Oh, I was going to say that I do think it's being sexist that any sexually active girl or just kind of silly, kind of look at my tits type of girl ends up getting killed in these horror films, because I think it's kind of like an incel sort of commentary on women that are sexually active, unfortunately. And even though it's kind of like the classic trope, I think that it's wrong, and I would love to see more female horror directors and writers, because I wonder how they can flip the switch on that. I think that would be a really exciting thing. Anyways, just my 2 cents.
That was really cool. Yeah, that's great audio.
Jessa Flux, she's, I think, at Jessa Flux. She's amazing, or at Undressed Jess or Jessa Flux. She's an awesome, awesome woman. She's beautiful, and she's a killer actress, and especially in horror. So
love it.
That's my little shout out.
I like what we're going to get into in the next episode really has a lot to say about exactly what Jessa just voiced.
Mm-hmm.
And, Carol J. Clover's argument kind of hinges on how we view the audience
mm-hmm.
in media and how the audience interacts with the main character in any book, movie, TV show, song,
right,
etc.
Right.
And that I won't spoil it, but we're in the next episode, we're going to address exactly, because Carol J. Clover wrote the book as kind of a rebuttal to a type of moral panic that was happening in the 80s, where in England they're called the video nasties. And it was a list of movies. They weren't all horror movies, but most of them were. And it was a response to the slasher genre erupting and just and home video. So home video initially was allowing a lot of films to skirt around censorship and ratings, because if they were a direct-to-video release, they didn't have to go through the rating system that movies have to go through to get distribution,
mm-hmm.
right? You have to have a rating of R or X or PG-13. That's decided by the MPAA, and in England, there's a legal body that does that over there.
Yeah.
But they were there's a problem. It's a problem is emerging. They're making these things straight to video, and then they just go to the video stores, and anybody can rent them. We can't control what people are watching. This is not good. And so in the UK, they had a list called the video nasties. That was the parlance. That was the official designation. But it was a list of videos that were essentially banned from being sold in the country because they were trying to circumvent the rating system, because there was this moral panic around the amount of sex and violence in these films, and that the primary audience for these films was teenage boys. And like, it was a big kind of debate. And so when she sort of threw her hat in the ring with this book, she had a very interesting thesis around that. And so the book was written as a response to essentially what was a moral panic, you know, much the way there have been moral panics over Satan worship, pornography, sex trafficking, like all of these things. Like, that was the moral panic of the day when she wrote the book. And so she was like, I have a response to this. Like, I think you guys are getting it all wrong. Right. So some critics argue that the final girl trope can inadvertently perpetuate a form of victim blaming. In many slasher films, characters who engage in premarital sex, drug use, or other immoral behaviors are often the first to be killed off. This can be interpreted as implying that these characters deserve their fate, reinforcing harmful stereotypes about women's sexuality. The final girl archetype has historically been depicted as a white heterosexual woman. So there's also a lack of diversity that can reinforce the idea that only a very specific type of woman, i.e. white and wealthy, is worthy of being the hero or survivor in horror films, marginalizing characters from different backgrounds and sexual orientations.
I watched some really great YouTube videos about the emergence of Black final girls, and
Okay.
there's some really great content out there that explores that a little bit more. The final girl often embodies conservative values and morality. While this can be seen as a positive aspect for some viewers, it can also suggest that those who deviate from these values are less valuable or less entitled to survival. Once again, you just put all of your weird obsessions onto this one girl and make her like this perfect virgin and doesn't drink or smoke, and she's just, you know, like a little princess. And the audience doesn't want her to die. When you present women who are scandalous and they have sex, I guess that's expendable. Or the boy who's a delinquent, or the character who is a Black person, you build up to, like, you know, but not that girl over there. She's none of those things, because the audiences were fucked, or the people making the narratives were fucked, or probably both. But yeah, I digress. While the final girl ultimately triumphs, the trope can still focus excessively on the character's victimhood and suffering, potentially perpetuating the idea that women in these films are primarily objects of violence and suffering. Or, as an aside, perpetuating the idea that the only interesting narrative about a woman is if she is deeply, violently, and or sexually traumatized. Like, that's a backstory. Call it a day.
Yeah, I agree. But I think it also kind of goes back to like my earlier statement, which is, given the statistical enormity of violence and suffering that women encounter while they're just trying to live their lives, is actually depicted relatively not very much at all compared to how much it happens.
That's true. That's true.
Right? Like the sort of casual, you know, and so it really depends on like which point of view you're meant to inhabit. And I think that gets into the crux of Carol J. Clover's seminal book, Men, Women, and Chainsaws, which is considered a defining text in film studies and film theory, beyond feminist theory, beyond horror theory, in cinema in general. She is going to kind of blow our minds open around the significance of whose point of view you're actually inhabiting and which character you're actually identifying with, and that makes all the difference in what these films, quote unquote, mean. Mm-hmm. Or what they say about us as the audience. But we're like running on time. Well, so we're gonna continue this. This is our Halloween edition. So next week we'll be back with part 2, and we're just gonna really deep dive into the text and what I think does not get enough lip service, which is her actual theory. Because to say the final girl is like, yes, she delineated a stock character and came up with a listicle of qualities she has, but that was like the opening of the book. That's
observation, not analysis.
Yeah, that wasn't any kind of analysis. But most times when people talk about the final girl, they kind of stop here. They just describe her and then talk about how that makes them feel. Mm-hmm. But without really delving into any kind of analysis around like who the audience is identifying with, mm-hmm. or, you know, how identification happens when we consume media, or looking at the way that the final girl is shot and filmed and written, mm-hmm. and what that tells us about who we're supposed to be identifying with. Mm-hmm. So I can't wait to like get into that, because it's pretty wild. I looked her up too, and if you go on YouTube, she's retired now from UC Berkeley, but you could see her, and if you like read the text and then you see her, it's kind of wild, because she watched a lot of horror films, and the way that she'll describe the plots of these things, like she does not shy away. So you're just going like, man, this woman has watched like thousands of like fabricated rapes and murders, and what like this person has like studied this shit, and she just looks like the sweetest, most like, and what's funny is like the majority of her other work is sort of like Nordic, Swedish, Icelandic like folk tradition. Mm-hmm. And then this book,
the synergistic effect of horror and feminist theory.
Yeah, like, and I read it in a day. I mean, it's really fucking fascinating. Her analysis is really fascinating. It's really made me look really differently at movies that I've always loved. Mm-hmm. And just, it's made me see them differently, and really, even in media beyond horror, really paying attention to that question of who is the observer? Who is that? You know, who is it you're actually meant to identify with?
Right.
Like that is what is, you know, like you can't, there's an assumption that if you're a boy watching the movie, you're identifying with the boys in the film. And if you're a girl watching the movie, and she was like, that's a pretty big assumption. Yeah. You know, and man, she gets into it. It's really fucking good. Well, it's really killer. It's really killer.
I love this. I love that we're doing a topic that is a little bit different from our norm, because I love highlighting the stories of women, but also highlighting the stories about women involving women.
Yeah.
And
I think,
perfect.
Yeah. And that's kind of what I always wanted to do with the show is to be approaching the topic. Because really, listen, the podcast is about the fact that I'm gay. And I just love women. Like, I love women. I love hearing about women. I love seeing women. I love pictures of women. I love movies of women, like stories about women. I love to just hear about women. Mm-hmm. That it just is, I'm just always like, tell me more. I want to know more about her. Who is she?
I want her to win, and I want her to survive by hook or by crook. I'm on her. I'm like, rooting for her.
Yeah. And so I wanted to do a podcast that's just like, here's awesome women. Here's some analysis of how women exist in the public sphere. Here's an interview with someone that was of ill repute and like went through the experience of being stigmatized, and they're going to talk about it. I kind of wanted it to be a bubble of just all things around women that goes beyond kind of a very surface level kind of like a surface level, like I said, like a listicle. Yeah. Look, these 10 outlaws. I want to know about each 10 female outlaws. I want to know about each one. Mm-hmm. I want to know about how her life circumstances were different, mm-hmm. and how that affected her crimes. Mm-hmm. Tell me everything. Mm-hmm. Like, I don't want a listicle. I want to know.
What did she do, and why did she do it? And why haven't they told the real story or the full story yet? Why are we piecing it together still?
Because like women don't do stupid shit. I mean, like sometimes they do, but like for the most part, like the way I realized I was biased against men is I realized that anytime I heard a story and like a woman was accused of a crime, my first question was like, well, what did he do to make her crazy? Like, what were the men in her life up to that drove her to do this antisocial act?
Because it's typically very
relevant. Because there's always a fucking dude standing right behind her. It's like, get behind me, Satan, and push. You know, like.
Oh my
god. That's like my favorite phrase. It really is.
I love that. Thank you for teaching me so far. I can't wait to learn more. I can't wait to share some of my favorite final girls with you. I have props.
Yes.
Yes.
Like
one prop.
I'm looking forward to part 2 because yes, we're digging into the actual analysis in the book instead of just summarizing. But also we get to have a whole discussion around what qualifies as a final girl and who our favorite final girls are and why. Okay. So I'm like super excited.
I'm excited too. Thank you for this day of learning on this. Well, not today, but when this is released, the day of my 14th porniversary. 14 grand years in the skin flick biz. And it brought me to you.
It did.
This
you were one
happen.
of the first, yeah. You were one of the first people I met in the industry, and then the fact that we're still here is pretty wild. Like, yeah.
Hell yeah.
We made it, and we're still alive.
I know, and we're still functional and making things and insisting that our voices be heard in some way instead of, letting people shut us up.
I know you're tired, but let's get into it for a minute because you did bring up your 14th porn anniversary. So here's some questions I would have for you on your 14th porn anniversary. Okay. What do you think is the biggest way that you have changed in the last 14? Like, what is the biggest way that you changed from when you came in to now?
I have gotten a much thicker skin. I have developed a much stronger voice that I use to advocate for myself, not just in, group rallies when we're doing it like for a cause, but also when, just in my personal life. I've grown more of a backbone. I have a lot more awareness of different social cues that I think really come with being a courtesan, kind of. And also just Ella Darling is like Ramtha is my IP. Like I invented her from aspects of my authentic pre-porn self that, are inescapable. And then aspects of my pre-porn self that I did not have, qualities I never was able to really cultivate in myself because I was shy and timid. But Ella Darling isn't. Ella Darling can do so much shit. And sort of the creation of that identity, I think, has been probably the biggest motivator for change, for growth, for everything. It helped me sort of take control over a life that I felt like I didn't have as much control of.
Yeah. What do you think is the biggest way the industry changed in 14 years from like when you came in to what it is now?
There is so much more agency and autonomy today than we saw 14 years ago in porn. There's more women in positions of power, whether they're directors or C-suite executives or middle management, just more women's voices along the way at companies. We also see companies hiring more and more from the talent pool, which is something I've been pushing for a long time, because that was how I was able to transition from porn to still porn, but like doing other stuff also, was a company was willing to give me a job. So it's that stuff. And also we went from, when I came in, solo girl sites were on the out. If you have your own personal site that people subscribe to, you're going to have to transition to clip stores And over the past few years with OnlyFans, solo girl sites, as long as they're part of that conglomerate, are profitable. You could just run your OnlyFans and pay your mortgage and live on it if you run it right. And that was not the case. When I got in, your success was dependent on the directors who deigned to hire you. And so there was a lot of ass kissing. There was a lot of networking that you had to do. I never did coke with my agent because I wasn't interested in doing coke, especially with him. And that impacted some of the roles that I got. And today, I would never have an agent if I started porn. Well, I don't advise anyone get into porn in the past 5 years. Like, just don't. It sucks. But, you know.
Why do you say that?
Well, because I think a lot of people are diving into porn because OnlyFans makes it seem really accessible. And OnlyFans doesn't explain to you the stigma that working even a day in this industry can carry for the rest of your life. I gave a whole talk at Expos a few years ago about 10 people who worked in porn for less than 6 months and lost careers over it. Obvious things like teachers, but like a real estate agent, even a Subway sandwich artist, because we can't even make a fucking sandwich for civilians because we're so tainted.
Oh my God.
And so that's it. It's like, okay, you join OnlyFans because everyone's doing it, whatever. OnlyFans doesn't tell you those things. OnlyFans doesn't tell you what a 2257 form is, which is the documentation you have to have for every scene that you produce in order to sell it. You have to have ID information for every performer, photos of their IDs, full release forms, 2257 forms for every piece of content, but not if you're on OnlyFans, because OnlyFans manages that for you. You can just post it and tag them, and then you can never sell that content for the rest of your life because you don't have the paperwork that makes it legal for you to do so. So that's something that, like, I appreciate OnlyFans has done, because it's, if you want to do sex work, you kind of can, but I think that we're missing a really big part of the equation here, which is increased educational discourse around this work coming from within the industry, so that it's not, the claptrap of people who want to save us.
I was thinking the other day, just spitballing here, do you think that OnlyFans will continue to grow, or do you think that eventually people will stop subscribing and do you think, I know that it really blew up during the pandemic because people were at home and they were really lonely and they wanted connection and they needed that stimulation and whatnot. And OnlyFans was definitely like a pay to play place to get that. Mm-hmm. Now the pandemic is ongoing. Yes. It is still here, but collectively we've decided it's over about a year ago. Do you think that there will slowly be like a decline? Do you think also, like, because there was this whole thing, 3 million content creators joined OnlyFans over the pandemic. That's 3 million sex workers now out in the world, right? And like, strength in numbers, and that's going to give us political leverage. And because like now we have this kind of huge uncontained workforce that can talk to each other online, but can't be kind of ruled by corporations. But I wonder if the average, the people in the top, I have two of my friends make 6 figures a month on OnlyFans, but the average person on OnlyFans makes like less than $200 per month. Mm-hmm. So I wonder if, yes, there was a rush of people getting on the app. It was normalizing sex work. It was revolutionizing everything. It was a game changer. But I'm wondering if after a couple years where people try it and then it's actually not that lucrative unless you don't already have some kind of following from somewhere else that you're trafficking into OnlyFans. will actually have them exiting the industry just as quickly and being like, oh, this is actually a shit industry.
Yeah. This sucks.
So I'm wondering if there's going to be like kind of a reversal at a certain point, because if you've got 3 million people joining and then most of them start doing sex work and only make like $100 a month, so then they leave. And so it might actually be creating a population of people that are going to be even more vehemently anti-sex work. There's like a popular ASMR artist that had an OnlyFans and had it for like a couple years, was doing like adult ASMR, right?
Yeah.
Like on the thing. And then she quit and has become like super vocal about like kind of what you were just saying, just that it, you know, it's a pox on the gender, not an empowerment. And I've seen some more like that, like people kind of, and there are people that were never in like our mainstream show up on set industry.
Yeah.
But an increased amount of people that did OnlyFans for a period of time and then left because they realized that it was kind of a scam.
Mm-hmm.
And so the person I'm talking about, she basically said the way that it's set up is like, she's like, I thought I'm going to do these tasteful ASMR videos. I'm going to do tasteful news. I'm going to be like Lana Del Rey. I'm going to be like a pinup. I'm going to do that. And she's like, and the thing is, the people that are consuming your content don't give a shit about that. And so all they do day and night is try to entice you to do things you're increasingly uncomfortable with for larger amounts of money. And so it's kind of like a gambling addiction. So girls come in thinking they're going to have like these really prescripted boundaries, but because of the game element of the app itself, tip me. How much can you tip? Will you tip this? Will you tip that? Like, because of the gamified nature of the transaction, that girls will start falling into doing things they're actually not comfortable with because they're so sucked into the game aspect of the app and seeing how much they can get, and and then one day waking up and realizing like, oh, I've made content or whatever that like actually was like super embarrassing to me. But in the moment, it was like they were offering $350, and it was like in the moment. And so her issues with it were kind of that the app has been gamified in a way that's almost like Snapchat, which is almost designed to really become addictive, especially to like younger people who are that are used to content being like that, and kind of they're used to the Snap system and like collecting points and getting like badges, and you know what that it's like, it's kind of set up in this way where it's like very insidious. I neither agree nor disagree with her analysis.
Okay,
but
so I feel like that is pretty much the argument that people have made about, you know, women in porn being victims of porn since before this was ever a thing. And my response, I feel the same about this as I did about that. It's that like, at the end of the day, these are adult women, and like, let's not infantilize them by thinking that they're just, you put a little gamification in front of them and they'll just show their titties to anyone. Like these are grown-up women who deal with boundaries all the time. I hear that though, being willing to shift your boundaries in the moment. And that's very, that's symptomatic of sex work. What I hope happens is that the sort of individual who might casually, playfully, as an aside, joke about their finances or their stress from their job or their school and say, I should just go do porn. I should just become a stripper. I should just start an OnlyFans and sell pictures of my feet. Bitch, nobody's buying pictures of your feet and nothing else. That's not a thing. Like, nobody knows who you are. They don't know whose feet these are. Like, that's not how it works. And it's such a Bader Meinhof misunderstanding of the whole fucking thing that I don't want people to come into sex work and then be harmed by it or carry that stigma. Yeah. I mean, it's going to happen. But if it's going to happen, I hope that at the end of the day, the realization is that maybe sex work is actually hard and challenging and a real job. And maybe sex workers are somebody that I should, hold in a higher regard rather than look down upon as the easy thing that I could do if I wasn't so committed to, my degree in sociology right now.
I mean, yes. I agree with what I'm picking up what you're putting down.
And then the other side of it is like, I think OnlyFans is going to enjoy a long-term Pornhub effect in which watching porn, still stigmatized, but talking about Pornhub, well, that's just a cultural institution. That's a mainstream brand. Whereas you wouldn't necessarily, joke about, you wouldn't see the same people making a joke where Pornhub is the punchline as they would about like Pink.com or Brazzers, because it's just a little bit more of a household name. I think the same is true for OnlyFans. So I think it will probably be a place as long as they don't do something stupid like ban sex work again.
Yeah. I mean, I like what I always tell people when they ask why I retired, and I was like, because sex work became work. And I'm not about that life. Like, I did not get into porn to do work. And it got to a point where in order to make money, you had to be your own producer. Like, I can book a scene, I can book the location, I can light it, I can film it, I can act in it, I can perform in it, I can do taxes for it, I can do payroll for it, I can do all the paperwork for it, I can create the soundtrack for it, I can edit it, I can distribute it, I can promote it, I can market it, I can cross-promote, cross-brand it. I can do all of that. Those are great skills that I have. I don't want them.
Yeah.
That is already 10 more jobs than I fucking want. I'm someone that needs a producer. Like, I don't want to work. So I love that sex work is work. And like, it totally is. But I didn't sign up to do work. So I left. I was like, this is, if I wanted to do this much work, like, I don't know. I guess I would be a successful person. I'm a do nothing bitch. Like, I sit around and write and come up with ideas, and I am attractive, and that's my job because it requires no work.
That's why I semi-retired in 2016, because it was like, I liked porn when I just had to show up, be pretty, and have sex, and then go home, because that is the job that I was walking into signing up for. I never liked shooting clips. I hate editing video of myself.
Oh my God.
The only reason I started in OnlyFans is because in 2020, my former co-founder, etc., and I dissolved our company and moved across the country. So now I don't have, hold on. The only reason I started in OnlyFans in 2020 was because my co-founder and I dissolved our company, and we both moved across the country in the middle of a pandemic. So the people I knew in Austin were my parents, my ex-co-founder, and like some friends that I knew from before who I can't see anyway. So I started OnlyFans because I didn't have a big company that I was running anymore, and I didn't have a roommate or much of a social scene. And OnlyFans, I believe you described it once, it's like Twitter, except everybody likes you.
Yes.
And that was great for me. But I too am suffering from like, man, gravity is weighing down so hard, and my makeup brushes are so heavy that producing content, man. I'm going to get a touch of the vapors thinking about it.
Yeah. I'm just like, I don't, first thing I ever wanted to be when I grew up was powerful. And then more realistically, I realized that I just never wanted to have a proper job. And I never have. I mean, I worked 3 jobs to put myself through college. When I left, I was like, that was horrible. And all I have to show for it is this dumb fucking humanities degree. And I just was like, I don't care what I do. I just don't want to ever like have to wear sensible shoes and carry a briefcase. And like the minute that porn, I looked around and girls were like, I'm not so much a porn star as I am an entrepreneur. And I was like, oh shit, we have entrepreneurs in here. We're doing entrepreneurship. I'm out. That sounds like a fucking regular ass fucking job. And I didn't sign up to be an admin. I signed up to get fucking railed. Okay. Like I didn't, what is my, worship me, pay me money. I go home.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's like, I thought that's what I was trading off. Like, oh, I'm fuckable. Like, cool. You're going to pay me to be fuckable? Because normally I just get harassed for that. So I like this. And I had all this time to just do stand up and just write. I was like, this is perfect. And like, Eula Biss has this book on having and being had. And she talks about this thing about a writer. And I remember like underlining the quote. And she's like, the thing that differentiates writers from other people is that we will literally do anything for time, to have time to write.
Right.
And I was like, that's, yeah. Like I'll literally like suck dick on camera if I only have to work 4 days a month.
If it means people leave me the
to
fuck
pay
alone.
my bills.
Yeah.
So that like I can spend the rest of my time just like writing screenplays and going out and doing stand up and going on tour. And like, if it's going to afford all of these things with a very minimal input, by the time I left, you had to have an OnlyFans and all this stuff. And like, it was a fucking full-time job.
Yeah.
And
hustle culture came for hoes so hard.
Yeah. And like, I respect all of the bad bitches out there that are doing their thing. But I did not come here to work. I do not dream of labor, as James Baldwin famously said. I dream job. I do not dream of labor.
Fantastic quote. One of my All right.
Okay.
All right.
Congratulations. Happy 14th porniversary.
Thank you.
Your porn career is ready to enroll in high school.
That's fantastic. That almost makes me a MILF.
You'll never be a MILF.
Thank you.
Ever.
All I want to hear. You know all the right things
Never.
to say. Love you.
No, I mean, honestly, no, never. That will never happen. You're not baking a cake. We're not doing that.
No.
Not in this house. We're not doing that.
No.
Like, let's be real. If you were going to have kids, you would have them already.
Probably so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
People that want children tend to have them. So.
Yeah. All right. I love you.
I love you.
Thanks for listening. Oh, hey, please like and subscribe to our podcast and to like this episode, like the podcast, like this video on YouTube. Like it if it's a reel, just like the fuck out of it, subscribe the fuck out of it, and tell your smart friends, because your smart friends are gonna like us. My smart friends are really excited about what we're doing with this podcast, which makes me feel really good. So if you have cool smart friends and you want to get in their good graces, tell them to listen to some hoes talk about hoe shit.
Yeah. That's what the podcast is, isn't it?
Yeah. So thank you. We appreciate you.
Yes. All right, guys. See you next week.
Bye.
Bye.